Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Mangiaracina. I'm with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and I'll be helping facilitate today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to provide you with a brief overview of how our webinar system works and how you can interact with today's presenters. Below the PowerPoint, you should see a materials box with a PDF of today's presentation. To download it, simply select the file and click the Download File button. A new browser window will open confirming that you wish to download, and once you confirm, your download should begin. The web links box is also located under the PowerPoint and contains information related to today's event. You can click on the web link you desire, click Browse to open a new window to the website's location. To the right of the PowerPoint, you should see a chat box. Within this window, you'll be able to send messages to the presenters and to the other participants. Chat entered into the Everyone tab will be stored and may be posted online as part of the recording of this webinar. At the end of the presentation, a survey will appear on your screen asking you to provide feedback on how we did today. At the end of the survey, you'll have the opportunity to request a certificate of attendance for this event. Please remain on the webinar until the survey appears on your screen. The link to the survey is also available on the right side of the screen in the web links box. Thank you for your attention as I explain the features of our webinar system. Welcome to Working with Men Who Batter, hosted by the Resource Center on Domestic Violence, Child Protection, and Custody. To begin today's presentation, I would like to introduce Fernando Medeiros with the Battered Women's Justice Project.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for those of you who are at a different time. So again, my name is Fernando Medeiros, and I'm going to talk to you today about working with men who batter, and I'm going to do it from the angle of how can we understand this population better, understand their risks, look at what to do, and also understand what are the levers for change in this population, which is something that may not be all that familiar to people. And in this process, by the way, I'm going to be alluding back to some research that I've done. So it's focus group research with men who had attended fatherhood programs and who had been involved with child welfare. These are men who have been exposed to domestic violence in their lives, as you will find out, but they were not specifically there because they had personally a history of perpetration of domestic violence. But the issue that is most important is that I'm going to be talking about things that we know seem to resonate with a group of low-income men who were African American, Latino, and Caucasian. So I think we skipped, okay. So in terms of who are they, I'm going to start by talking about what do we know about the research about men who batter. And this is some statistics that I put together both from some of the long-term research on batter intervention programs and also the lethality assessment or dangerousness assessment that Jackie Campbell has been working on for many years. At the end of this presentation in the PowerPoint, you'll see sites for all of this. And let me say, as I start, that one interesting thing is that if you work in a battered women's shelter or in other locations, your experience and awareness of men who batter is going to be filtered by the particular population that you work with. So my experience is that people who work in battered women's shelters are really hearing about men who are very controlling and are in the upper levels of violence. A lot of what I'm talking about here is for the less violent and the less controlling part of the population, because I'm going to be talking about possibilities for change and, in a sense, for developing empathy. So going back to the population, what do we know about them? Well, it seems that in a variety of different surveys, and these were surveys of men who were originally arrested because they assaulted a partner or violated a restraining order. So it is that specific population, but these are studies that have been carried out in different places in the country. So about 40 to 60% of that population is moderately violent. Now I realize that there is a cruel irony in saying moderately violent, but it is true that there is a subgroup here of men who have lower levels of violence, have lower levels of control. Their impact on their partners and on their families is not as severe and debilitating as other men may be. And the other thing is that we believe that these men have much more capacity for change and a greater capacity for self-reflection in that process. By the way, let me just say that as I am talking, I'm seeing your questions in the chat. So feel free to put in any questions or comments. I'll try to react to what you're saying real time. So a second large group in the populations of samples of men who have been mandated to batterer intervention programs are the ongoing reassaulters. And these are people who don't seem to consistently stop their violent behavior. They seem to just continue being abusive, continue being controlling, and their level of violence may vary, but it just doesn't seem to stop. And again, both the violence and the control are elevated, although there is a special category that we also know a group of men that I'm going to talk about a little later that don't seem to have violence but are quite dangerous. At any rate, the ongoing reassaulters, the generally violent men, are what we usually think of as the antisocial folks. These are people who often have a criminal lifestyle. They are, in my experience with them, they are typically guys who are from a working class or low-income background who grew up in a community and for a variety of reasons, perhaps their limited educational achievement and opportunity, they ended up on the street corner dealing, perhaps dealing, selling guns, perhaps even worse, doing prostitution. And a lot of these men, what I have found is that, again, there's a range in this population of how abusive this subgroup can be. But what I find with these generally violent men is two things. One is that their violence and control is very broad. It just goes on with everybody. It's not limited just to their partners. In fact, some of them say that, and I have talked to partners in this process, some of them say that, in fact, the violence towards partner is much less than the violence in the community. The other thing I'll say that's important about this group is that a lot of them really do have potential to change. It seems that some of the generally violent men, they are going through a very toxic life stage, and a lot of them can, in a sense, change that narrative for themselves. They come to a point where they've gotten arrested one too many times, they're facing more time, or another thing that we've often seen is that they have children and they begin to think about the children. It may not be the first child, it may be the third child. But within those toxic behaviors, these men may have, there's a bunch that seem to have a real capacity for love, and it will work on them internally. The second group of the ongoing reassaulters, as you see there, is the obsessive, possessive men. These are men who are very controlling, although there's also a range within this population from some people who can change to some people who end up being in a highly dangerous group. But they are very controlling. It's almost like they feel incomplete without their partners, so that whenever they feel some kind of pain, it's her fault. Whenever there's any pain in the relationship, anything going wrong, it's all about her. And she's just not good enough. And she goes from being a wonderful person to a terrible person. They tend to be also very jealous, very possessive, and they monitor their partners. Very often they're also doing stalking. And this particular subgroup, I think it's the more extreme people in this population are the ones who may end up killing their partners, so that the more extreme range of this group are really within that 5% or less of the people who can be really highly dangerous and nearly lethal. An important thing to keep in mind, is, as I mentioned earlier, is that in the research that Jackie Campbell carried out, which she found a very large subgroup of men who were lethal or potentially lethal who had never been violent with their partners until they went to this point where they finally assaulted her in a deadly or near deadly way. So the indicator for those men is that you find a partner who is enormously controlled in her life. All aspects of her life are intruded upon. There's just enormous control taking place. And you also find that sometimes, which is one of the identifiable risk factors here, sometimes those partners have been so damaged and so persecuted and so constrained in their lives by the control that they begin to think about suicide. They get to feel that there's no way I'm going to get away with this person, from this person, so suicide begins to feel an option. And that's, so I'm really trying to stress the reality of the extremes that victims of violence can experience. We also know, in terms of looking at risk, that substance abuse intensifies risk, also instability, and by that I mean that someone doesn't seem to have a place to live, they don't seem to have a job, they don't seem to be anywhere, although we have to be careful about that one. I think you have to be in stability with all the other indicators, because we also have a lot of very low-income men who don't have a place to live, and they don't have a job. Their life is just very up in the air. So instability can come from a variety of sources. If it seems to be coming because someone is so obsessed about their partner, thinking of keeping her, or thinking of getting her back if she's thinking of leaving, or having thoughts about really hurting her, and there's also this instability, that's when that instability really comes in as a real change, a real sign of high risk. We also know that this population is not a major mental health clinical group. In other words, if you're sitting in a batterer intervention program, what I call a BIP, you don't find large numbers of men who are very depressed. You don't find men who are acting psychotic. You find people who can function in a lot of ways, although we do find people who are personality disorders, who tend to be somewhat intractable, and we also find differing levels of trauma in the population. So as I'm continuing, I'm going to go on for a couple of minutes and then stop to see if there are any questions or comments. And if you want to, you can wait till then, and then I'll look at what people write in the chat room. So we come to what to do. and I'm looking at what to do. What should be our social response to this population? So I will eventually talk about engaging some of these men who batter about our conversation, which maybe can provoke them to take a look at themselves. But having said that, the first thing you need to do when you think about talking to these men is really to privilege safety. So in other words, make sure that if you're going to be talking to the man, that the partner knows, and maybe she can tell you confidentially how he responds to having anyone talk to him. And for example, and also you need to be absolutely sure that you don't do or say something that could subject her to retaliation. You must remember that we know that men who batter are really focused on their partners. So you might be talking to him and confront him or say something, and he might get very angry, but the reaction may really fall on her. So be careful about any information she gives you. Never share information, and always ask if you're going to share something. Is she okay with that? Is there a way is that going to really place her at high risk? So you really need to be careful about that and keep on checking as you go on. You also need to think about your own safety. And I think that, to me, if I'm working with someone and they're threatening, some people put on threat displays which is what they use with systems in general, particularly some men. If anyone threatens, or I always want to say, listen, do you realize you're making a threat here? I really want to be able to talk to you. I want to work with you. I think you're an important person in this community. You're important for your family. But if you threaten me, I can't really work with you. And then the threat itself becomes an issue. If I find that men react to that by backing away, that's a good sign. If they can't back away, then I really soft pedal the whole engagement, because it's probably not going to go anywhere. So having said all that, you may have more questions about the safety issue and so forth, but again, really, it needs to be the first thing that you think of for the family and the people who have been abused, as well as for yourself. So the other thing is accountability. We have in the United States, in varying levels, and it differs in many places, and sometimes it's not really there. But what we have come up with is what's called a coordinated community response, which is something that was first thought of in Duluth, Minnesota. And this means that you create a system or you create a collaboration where different systems, which could include the criminal justice system, and it's everything from the police to the prosecutors, probation officers, judges, parole officers, etc., has a stake in protecting victims of violence, and they also have not only a stake in protecting victims of violence, but in holding the abuser accountable, so to prevent him from perpetrating further acts of violence, but also to see if we can nudge him to change, which usually means that when you have a coordinated community response, you have the police usually will have a pro-arrest policy, and they will also have, if they get called for a domestic dispute and there's been an assault, they will have a pro-arrest policy, and they will also arrest if there's been a violation of a restraining order. So once someone has been arrested, they get adjudicated. And again, this is part of the coordinated community response system. The coordinated community response system, the response will be that once someone is adjudicated and they're found guilty, there'll be a decision they'll decide whether he goes to jail or whether he's placed on probation and mandated to attend a batterer intervention program and perhaps other kinds of programs as a condition of probation. And if he violates those conditions, he should be then incarcerated. So there should be a system where someone is attending a program and the program is willing to take on the responsibility of saying, this man is not attending, letting the probation department know, the parole department know that the man is not attending, that he's not complying with some of the conditions of probation, and that something else needs to happen with him. So that kind of accountability needs to, now we can't say whether when someone is attending a batterer intervention program, if they are changing. We may have suspicions, we may have feelings at different times. What we can't say is if someone isn't attending, if someone is not attending, or they're being disruptive, or they're saying things that we consider are very dangerous. So people in the batterer intervention program should see themselves as reporters of those signs of high risk and signs of no progress. So I'm going to move towards talking to men in different settings and how to frame the conversation. I really think of it as DV as a lifespan issue for men. I'd like to stop and ask, I'm going to look at the chat for a moment. And just comment on some of the things that people have said. So what about same-sex population, same-sex relationships? Let me just say that we don't have data on this kind of study with large numbers about LGBTQ populations attending batterer intervention programs. There are programs throughout the country. I just haven't seen any reports about their progress in these programs. So there's nothing that I can report at this point. But it is important to note that domestic violence does also take place in LGBTQ relationships, and maybe some of the things that I'm going to talk about may also work, but I would be very cautious. I'm talking about work, by the way, with populations that I know personally. So I can use research, but also I think what we have known from personal experience working with populations. So I'm looking at the questions again in the chat room. Single Muslim and physically abusive for a long period of time and eventually flee from a situation having shown seized abuse. Yes, I'm going to talk about the impact on children. So I think the question is saying, is getting into the issue of does witnessing domestic violence have an impact in terms of becoming an abuser? And I'm going to speak to that in a moment. So, okay. There is one question that I don't quite understand. Maybe it's by, seems like an increase in homicide, suicide, and or suicide by cop. How to factor in the highest, most dangerous cases. I'm not quite clear about the angle. So if that person wants to sharpen that question, I would appreciate it. So I'm going to continue. So what do I mean by DV as a lifespan issue for men? With the communities of men that I work with, if you ask them, what do you know about domestic violence? Very often, the two spontaneous replies that come out, they'll say, police, arrest, go to jail. And then the other thing they'll say is, oh, that's a woman's issue. What we have found is that once we get into conversations with men, where it's not a situation where they're identified as abusers, and I'm not trying to sort of do anything, directly about holding them accountable. So if I'm having a conversation which is simply informational, and asking them about how they understand things and so forth, what tends to come out, and as you'll see, is that a very large number of men witness domestic violence as children. And from the research, we know that there's a profound impact there. We also, what I've also have seen is that a lot of these men, even though when we first bring up domestic violence, someone will always mutter, well, women are violent too, or something like that. In reality, when they think about children, and remember, I'm referring to guys, low-income, African-American, Latino, and Caucasian men who had attended a fatherhood program, so that they are keyed into children a bit more, perhaps. But they're very concerned about domestic violence and role modeling, and they're aware of that. So that's another lifespan issue for the men. They're aware that what they do with their kids as they are growing up is going to have an impact on them, and you'll hear more about that. The other thing that we're not going to explore as much as we continue is that we also hear from men who have partnered with women and children. So a guy, moved in with someone, and it turns out that she had been abused in a prior relationship, and the children perhaps had either been abused themselves or had witnessed the abuse. So that someone is all of a sudden living in a family where the prior father or father figure was abusive, and that creates a lot of dynamics that the men walk into. And one risk that the men have pointed out to me, by the way, and that we have sort of identified, is the risk that a guy who is not abusive himself gets into a relationship with a woman who was abused and finds that she doesn't argue, that she backs off, that she really doesn't sort of assert herself in a lot of ways, and he piggybacks on that history. It's because of her legacy. She may feel a fear that how he's going to react if she gets angry at him, or she disagrees, or she doesn't like what he's doing, or something like that. So there may be a lot of silence and a lot of sort of her backing off. We also need to think about helping men with those issues, and how they also work with children who have trauma. But we're really, I'm going to put that in the parking lot. That could be another thing to follow up at some point. I want to continue with the lifespan issues of witnessing DV as a child. We found that with a partner, I did, a research partner, I did 5 focus groups, 4 in Massachusetts and 1 in Florida, in Miami, in Spanish. And in our focus groups, we had about 50 men, and again, they were Caucasian, Latino, and African American. There were also immigrants from other places, from the Caribbean, as well as from Africa in the group. But those were very small numbers. We found that 60 to 70% of the men had been exposed to domestic violence as children. We asked, and by the way, it says 50 to 60, is really more like 60 to 70. But we asked a very simple question. How do you, imagine a 3-year-old who's at home with his mom, and his dad comes home from work. It's about 5:30. The dad sees there are dirty dishes in the kitchen, and he starts yelling at the mom and insults her. And then he goes to the bathroom, and he finds a dirty dish with food in it in the bathroom. And at that point, he gets into a rage, comes out of the bathroom with the dish, throws it against the wall, breaks it. And his partner yells at him. This is a very simple scenario that we're giving them. His partner yells at him, and then he slaps her. She falls to the ground, and then he's standing over her, screaming abuse and insults at her while she's lying on the ground. And a 3-year-old little boy is watching this. So we asked this question to gauge, how do you understand domestic violence and the impact of domestic violence on children? Do you understand anything about it? Is this something that you have thought about? We knew that this is not something that was covered in their fatherhood program, so this knowledge would come from life experience. We were shocked at the detail of the information that we got from the men. They were very clear about the emotional, psychological impact on 3-year-olds, and what was really also very interesting is that men would say, he's probably going to shut down and be terrified, and you know, that's the way it was when I went through it. So again, all of a sudden, all these stories were started pouring out in the group. And from that moment, they kind of took over the group, and they were talking about their own life experiences and their exposure to domestic violence. I would have to say that as someone who has worked with men for many years, over 30 years, I was shocked at the level of emotion in the room. Particularly, quite a few men started crying or trembling. And some of them who didn't speak, you could see that they literally shrank in their chairs and just put their head down, so that even those who didn't speak, we were seeing signs of, you know, there's experience here. But there are many, many quotes, you know, but the themes that come out is the emotional, as I have there, fear, terror, anger, wanting to protect mom, and then just having a lasting rage and trauma in their life. Men said something, you are changed, things like you are changed forever, you cannot go back. The whole world changed at that moment. I am not the same person that I would have been. I looked at everyone in a different way. I knew life was not good. And there were quite a few, probably about half the men who reported witnessing domestic violence as children. About half of them made a plan to kill the abuser, usually with their siblings. We found some men who, you know, in the groups, we found some men who actually attempted to kill the abuser and didn't succeed. One person actually did succeed, sadly enough. And also, there was suicide. Another thing that they talked about was that I became an angry kid. I became the go-to kid if anyone was fighting in my neighborhood. I was always beating heads. So this brings us to the legacy and modeling issue. What we found is that the men, I never found, you know, without exception, they really hated the abuser. They, it was painful. They felt those of them who loved the abuser because he was their dad or their stepfather who took care of them, were particularly repulsed and hurt, and it's a very interesting thing because in the conversations with the men, it seemed to be that there were two pathways. One of them was, I am determined not to be like my father or a father figure. No matter what, I am not going to be like that person. And or then the other way was completely the opposite, that there was a lot of anger and rage about what they had witnessed. So they became the rageful person, and slowly they became the person they hated. And it's interesting because I think that it was clear to me that these men did not see, did not have in their lives, the ones who turned to violence, did not seem to have in their lives a way to kind of process or internalize or integrate, I don't know, I'm using somewhat clinical terms, but they didn't have any way to process the horrible things they were seeing, and they're kind of the way that men are typically socialized. You're not supposed to recognize pain. You're not supposed to recognize fear. You're not supposed to recognize helplessness, vulnerability. All those things are off the page. So if no one helps you with all that stuff, I think it became very easy for a lot of these men to kind of take up a version of what I call hyper-masculinity, which is that, you know, that kind of what we often think of as traditional masculinity, but I really think of it as hyper in the sense that it's all bound up with a sense of power, with a sense of invulnerability, with numbness, and sort of accepting anger and coercion and control as a way of being in the world. It doesn't tell us all that story about those men, but that hyper-masculinity kind of served as a really toxic solution for their feelings, which they need to undo. So the other thing that we found is that the men were keenly aware. When I gave them that scenario about a dad who comes home, starts yelling at mom because kitchen's dirty, goes in the bathroom, and ends up throwing a dish and then hitting her and so forth, we asked them, you know, suppose there was a 4-year-old little girl watching this, and then an 11 or 12-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl. We asked about different genders and different ages, and we found a really, which we didn't expect, a very clear sense that there was going to be a different impact from witnessing in boys and in girls. They really felt that their major concern for boys was, I'll do things and he'll turn out to be either violent or he'll become a batterer. So there really was a lot of modeling for them that they thought of doing, and also giving certain lessons. They were also very clear, by the way, that this is something that what you say has to match what you do. You cannot BS this issue. So, on the other hand, with girls, again, despite the fact that at the beginning of these groups, when we brought up domestic violence and men, invariably someone or another would mutter, women are violent too. Nevertheless, when they talked about daughters, their concern was that their exposure to domestic violence from men, and they were really worried about this. And they saw themselves, typically a man would say, I can't be the first man in her life and end up hitting her because I'm punishing her, or abusing her mother, or hitting her mother, or something like that, because the message is that if a man loves you, that's what he's going to do. That's normal. I don't want my daughter to have that message. They also thought about, which I thought was fascinating, and this came up in every group, they thought about talking to their daughters about love, and what healthy love from a man should look like, and they mentioned, if love should not mean control. Love should not mean that someone's hurting you. Love should mean that someone respects you, someone listens to you, someone accepts that you have your own point of view, your own accomplishments, and maybe you have conflict and stuff, but it doesn't involve violence. It doesn't involve fear. It doesn't involve hurting you physically or emotionally just to control you. So what they had to say about girls was actually quite rich. And this kind of surprised you, and it surprised us, by the way. So what we were beginning to understand is that these men have these pathways to into the world of domestic violence in their childhood, and that a lot of it, just without exception, all of them said, no one's ever talked to me about this. No one's ever asked me about this. And as a researcher, by the way, I was surprised to have people come up and hug me, and some of them crying, hug me and thank me for being able to talk about this for the first time. Now, another really interesting thing that happened was that, so imagine you have this room of men, and about 70% of them, 60 to 70%, talk about being exposed to domestic violence and show a lot of feeling. And also, part of their accounts were about how they were hiding in a closet when they were a little kid, how they were hiding under a bed, how they were maybe, hugging a little brother or a little sister, or getting hugged by an older brother or sister, how they pretended to be asleep no matter how loud things got. So this thing that men will say at times, the children didn't hear it, they were asleep or something like that, it just totally blew that away. So we're sitting in a room with this knowledge where they are, in effect, testifying that there's no way that this can be happening in my home without me being affected by it and affected in a profound way. That, this statement came up, I don't know from whom, but, some guy said you cannot hurt or abuse your children's mother without also hurting your children. This became kind of a really helpful way for them to encapsulate this experience. And it's a kind of a protective understanding for them. It's something that I think is kind of a protective factor. So let me go into, are there any questions that I need to pay attention to? I've been looking at the chat, but I realized I can't quite read and speak at the same time. I will talk about, I will talk about programming for children. Okay. All right. So I'm imagining that you're all in different parts of systems. You're in batterer intervention programs, perhaps, in battered women's shelters, in child welfare, in the courts, and in other places in the community. Maybe some of you are in fatherhood programs. So I'm thinking about using this information about men's exposure and prior impact from domestic violence in their childhood as a way to enter a conversation that helps a man who is now that dad who is maybe traumatizing his children, helping him understand that what he's doing goes well beyond just his partner. So I will usually start a conversation and say, hey, suppose someone has just gotten arrested for assaulting their partner. Maybe there's a restraining order, they're out of their home. Typically, they're very angry, they feel very defensive, and so forth. So one way that I approach this is to say, listen, I just want to talk about this, but I'm worried about you, and I'm worried about your family. And this is what I do. This is just one model, so you may have your own style. But I'll say to people, I saw a lot of domestic violence in my life, and it really impacted my whole life. It impacted also how I felt about my father. I got to the point where I didn't trust him, and in fact, I kind of hated him. Now, I'm not saying that all of us have to disclose by any means, but this is what I use. I know that when I share this with someone, it's not about, I'm okay and you're not. It's really, it's getting across that there's been a shared challenge in our lives. and I've seen that challenge. I understand it, and I'm talking about it without labeling him, without blaming him. But I am saying, are you aware that this could have a big impact? Another very simple was, if you know someone, what was your childhood like? What were your father and father figures like? What memories or understandings and feelings are you left with? Because you also find that, that there's a lot of perhaps sadness or anger, and once they talk about the sadness or anger, they may tell you about what actually brought that about. And then the more direct questions is, did you witness any domestic violence as a child? How did it impact you? And how did it impact your mom? What did you see happen in your family? It is very important. One really key skill that I think we need to have is being able to talk unendingly about and in great detail about the impact of witnessing domestic violence on children. Because the more we can get across about this, if the man is a father, let me go on to the next slide. If he's a father or a stepfather or the mother's boyfriend who has been with her for a while, and we know that there's been children in his life, he may not feel this way, but if he is there living in the home as an adult male, the children are going to want him to be there as a dad, and maybe that was his experience too. So I'm trying to connect his own history to what's happening now. So he takes a look at himself and realizes, I'm doing stuff that it's much bigger than, getting angry at her and, hitting her or, in his mind lashing out at her or something like that. I am doing something it's really hurting my kids. And after this conversation, I can't deny it. Now, maybe he doesn't accept that right during this conversation. But it really, what I have found is that saying these things, laying it out to the men, I found that it tends to work on them on their own time because it begins to resonate with his own experience. So, and by the way, if he has children and you talk about the impact on children and he does not respond, it does not resonate for him, you may have someone who is kind of really fundamentally lacking empathy. I remember a man in one of the fatherhood groups who revealed that he had been violent or was being violent to his partner. We began working with him. And then one of the men said, you're involved with child welfare. If you continue being violent, one of the things that's going to happen is that they're going to ask her to get you out of the home, but even before that, they're going to take away the children. Are you going to be okay with that? And his response was, listen, if they take away his kids, I can get another woman, I can have another bunch of kids. And he wasn't saying this as just sort of upping the ante, a superficial response. It really was what was in his mind. So we knew that man represented a very serious risk, and he didn't have some parts within him that might have served to restrain his behavior. So be aware of that as you have this conversation. Now, if he does not have children or stepchildren, maybe he was exposed to DV, and talk about the impact on him and his family. If he can connect with the impact of DV, and again, it's without labeling him, it's without blaming him, but if he can connect with this and begin seeing it, he may realize that he's passing on the same thing to his current family. So that may be something that works on him also. And finally, we have, oops, did I go through? All right, okay, here we are. So, and finally, we have the issue that some of you in the chat room have talked about trauma. We're actually going to be doing another round of focus groups on the issue of trauma because we did begin having informal, non-research sort of conversations with groups of men about trauma. And we found again a real outpouring of experience and feeling, and also those situations where a lot of men were trembling and crying. We also found that in talking about trauma, we realized that we always have to be very careful and think this through before you get into this conversation. If you're going to talk about trauma with the men, make sure that you have looked at your own history of trauma and have some level of comfort and familiarity with it, so that you're not having a conversation as people are saying things and you're kind of falling apart in the process, or you're trying to heal in that process. Remember, it's really for them. So you have to have done some of your own trauma work. In addition, it's important to always do two things. Be aware that when you talk about trauma, you can escalate people, and you don't want to have a chance of escalating someone towards a partner. And we call that also in the trauma world, that's called triggering. So it's very important to make sure you frame the conversation and people are free to tell you or not tell you things at the level of comfort, number one. Secondly, always, 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 always give the messages that when we talk about trauma and when you think about trauma, you have to remember that you're responsible for whatever you do when you're touching your trauma. So responsibility does not stop because you are having a personally difficult reaction. And I also up the ante and say to the men, if you don't heal from your trauma, once you know you have it, if you don't work on it, you will pass it on. You will pass it on to the people in your life. Again, if you don't take responsibility for it, if you don't work on it, you will pass it on. And it's curiously, there's no argument about this. Once they hear this, they kind of get it. Now, the other thing we found, the third thing that we think is very important if you're going to talk about trauma is to make sure you give the men immediately some tools for self-management, because they may be talking about their trauma. Perhaps the only way they have to deal with it is just to shut down and go numb, stop talking, withdraw, or get into a rage. So they need a tool. And there are a variety of tools, from simple sort of physical awareness exercises to meditation exercises to breathing exercises to being able to talk, to perhaps get into some kind of group where you can talk about this, perhaps decide that you need to go to counseling to help you with this. All of those things are options, but we also, at the moment, we want to give them tools. And the other thing that we found about trauma, and I haven't found any research about this, is that in every group, we had one, sometimes two men who would say something like, well, I don't think I have trauma, but, you know, anytime someone gets in my face and starts yelling at me, I black out and I come to and the person's hurt, and I've gotten arrested and gone to jail a couple of times. Now, some of this was, a lot of this was from the men that are considered that sort of generally violent group that seem to have a lot of sort of trauma, violence reactiveness. Now, when we understood this, we had these conversations, we understood that this was different from the kind of triggering that sometimes men who batter claim when they say, she made me do it, she pushed me, she went too far, she knew what I was going to do, and she still pushed me. I'm not talking about that kind of triggering, because that may not be about trauma. That may just be about control and the kind of invisible lines that he's trying to impose on her behavior. I'm talking about a reaction where something small or something not very big happens, and the person has a major reaction, which really puts them and other people at risk. So we had a man who talked about this, and his reaction, he had gotten arrested twice, because people yelled at him, and he blacked out, and he came to and he found that he had badly beaten up people. I spent some time talking to him. We gave him some follow-up, and we also gave him some tools. And we're still working with him, but it was interesting that he had a similar reaction a few weeks later. He was with his girlfriend, and they got into an argument, and she started yelling at him, and she was really pissed off, and she used some bad language or whatever, and he apparently had one of these events, but instead of assaulting her, he left. He went to a bar and drank, we were able to reconstruct this later, he drank 11 shots, got into his car, and had a major argument where he, had a major accident where he destroyed his car and broke 10 ribs. Now, he hasn't reacted like this ever since then. I think that he kind of encapsulated or kind of began to integrate something about what had happened at that time. But the people who worked with him felt that, that his reaction had not been against her. He had damaged himself. He had transferred it from assaulting another person to, in a sense, putting himself at terrible risk. So I don't, in a sense, I think that is progress, even though it is very sad, and it could have been deadly for him and whoever else he could have actually run into while he was completely drunk in the car. But I think it does, to me, it does begin to frame attention to trauma with low-income men as an issue that we need to begin thinking about. In fact, in the trauma literature regarding men, you see a lot of stuff about soldiers, about young men who were sexually, or boys who were sexually abused as boys, and you also see trauma stuff about first responders. But low-income men, they may be seen to have trauma as kids, and then after that, they're just perpetrators. So thinking about this and being able to talk to them about this and giving them a way to begin to work this through and begin to understand that inner territory, that inner arena that they have is useful. Because I think that what we're beginning to see is that the response to the pain and the helplessness and the horror, whatever caused the trauma, ends up with a lot of men sort of being short-circuited, and then they leap into the hyper-masculinity as, quote-unquote, a solution to all that pain. And if we can perhaps give them another option, we're kind of undermining the attraction of hypermasculinity. So I think I'm at the end. I'm going to look at see if there are any other questions that people have, any things that I can. And by the way, let me just say that I have a lot of tip sheets about different aspects of this work, but I was not sure what professions and disciplines were being represented, so I didn't want to put up just stuff that had to do with child welfare or fatherhood groups or whatever. So I'll be very happy if people email me and ask me for different kinds of materials or thoughts. I'll be glad to follow through with you. And my email is in the front of the PowerPoint. So where are we right now? Let me see. Are there any other questions? Amber and Melissa, is there anything else that I should be thinking about?
No, I think that was great. Thank you so much, Fernando. Amber, if you will go ahead and remind participants how they can access the survey and a certificate of participation, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, great. So if you look right below our PowerPoint presentation, there is now a materials box in the bottom left-hand corner. That is where you will download a PDF of the PowerPoint. I know a lot of you were asking about that in the chat box. Right next to that, in the web links box, there is a link to our survey. You just click the link that you want and press Browse To. It will also come up automatically when we close out the webinar today. At the bottom of the survey is where you will sign up to get a certificate of attendance. So if you would like that, please make sure to complete the survey for us.
By the way, can I just say something very quickly?
Sure.
I just put up the slide with the sources, and there's two slides, two sources. One is Edmund and Kafalis, Promises I Can Keep, and the other one is Edmund and Nelson, Doing the Best I Can. Those are books about low-income men and women and their relationships, and they really explore a lot of the dynamics, because I think one of the things that's happening is we have some of the violence that we're seeing is domestic violence with a lot of control and the other forms of abuse, and then there's also violence that's kind of taking place in the community and spilling into the family space. And I think even Kafalis, and particularly Eden in her research, has just done terrific work, and the books are really readable. They're participant observations where they're kind of living with families and having these long interviews. So it's not dense stuff. It's a good read. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you to all of the participants for joining us today.